But anyway, you don't have the sense, at least from what we can see on the outside, that Trump is willing to make any meaningful concessions to the Iranians and let them walk away with a victory. So it appears that he may very well roll the dice.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm thinking. If it does going back into this war, it's going to have to be much higher intensity, despite being fewer military targets they have left. Uh, but that means, yeah, the Iranians have very little reason to have any restraint. As you said, they can shut down the Red Sea. They can essentially destroy a lot of the Gulf states. They can cut internet cables. They can make a significant territorial conquests against Kuwait through have the Iraqis do it. I mean, there's so much that can be done. Uh, it's yeah, this is why it's hard to imagine them going down this path. But let's say instead of escalating, going back into the war, Trump decides to instead strengthen the blockade. So one of the problems now is they have to have too far distance from the Iranian coast. But what if they moved it, for example, to the Strait of Malacca or something to cut off the Iranian ships there? Also, of course, bringing the war to some extent to China? Do you think this is, something like this is possible, where they essentially begin to draw in more actors?
Well, the problem here is not where the blockade is located. The problem here is that the blockade does not inflict sufficient punishment on Iran to get it to surrender. And as long as Iran doesn't surrender and the Strait of Hormuz is closed, this has huge consequences for the international economy. And as time goes by, the situation just worsens. If you look at what's happening to inflation inside the United States and around the world, and you start thinking about the problems that various countries are having servicing their debt or their debts, and how this is likely to become a more acute problem over time, what you see is that the incentives for President Trump to shut this war down sooner rather than later are very great. But again, how does he do that? And I think where the blockade is located just doesn't matter very much. And that's why I think that continuing the blockade is not a viable alternative. And I think the Trump administration recognizes that. That's why we're talking about going back to bombing. We're talking about going back to bombing because the blockade doesn't work. Uh, and you want to remember that just as the countries in the Gulf outside of Iran are looking for ways to beat the blockade, the Iranians themselves are looking for ways to beat the blockade. And all of the players have some options here. So the Iranians are hard at work trying to figure out different ways to get around the blockade, and they have some cards to play here. And that's what makes it very difficult to inflict the kind of punishment on Iran that might, and I underline the word might get the Iranians to surrender.
Well, I just have a hard time seeing the overall strategy or direction of the US here, though. Where exactly are they going? Because we were told in the national security strategy of 25 that the US was likely heading in a more multipolar, well, adjusting to a multipolar, sorry, distribution of power. Now we see a lot of these wars, they seem to have objective of restoring primacy for no good reason. A lot of the relationships have been spoiled, for example, with the Europeans, the East Asians, well, the Gulf states are probably accidentally so, but international law is falling apart. No one's trusting diplomacy anymore. This is a key problem for the Iranian and the Russian side, is they wouldn't actually trust anything, not just at the US side, but the Europeans as well. So how do you, where if you take a step back looking at all of these conflicts at the same time, how do you think the US will adjust to this? Because at one point I thought that the US could flip this to an opportunity. It could just argue, well, whenever we wanted to get out of the Middle East anyways, we're going to pivot out. The Europeans, they didn't help us. We'll go away from Europe too. And they can, they could essentially make this adjustment to multipolarity, but it doesn't seem this is the pathway. So where is the US going here, though?
Well, with regard to Europe, what the United States is doing is shifting the burden of dealing with the Ukraine conflict onto the shoulders of the Europeans. And the United States is doing everything it can to wean itself off that conflict, let the Europeans handle it. With regard to East Asia, it's quite clear from Trump's recent trip to Beijing that what he's doing is going to great lengths to make sure that there's no crisis in East Asia, and certainly no war in East Asia involving the United States. That would be a total disaster for the United States, certainly at this point in time. And that brings us to the Middle East. This is where we are deeply involved in fighting a war. Again, we're not fighting the war in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are fighting the war, and we've been helping them for sure, but we're not doing the actual fighting. And certainly we're not doing any fighting in East Asia, thankfully. But the place where we are doing the fighting is in the Middle East. This is the Iran war. And the question is, what can we do to get out of that? And, it's funny, but I often sort of think about the Vietnam War when I think about the Iran war. And you want to remember in 1968, after President Johnson says that he's not going to run again because he's effectively been destroyed by the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon runs against Hubert Humphrey, and Richard Nixon wins the election in November of 68, and he takes over in January of 69. And Nixon made it clear when he was campaigning that he had a secret plan to end the war, and he was going to end the war quickly. Well, if you look at what happened after Nixon comes into office, he was not interested in ending the war. He wanted to stay in the fight. He did not want to concede defeat. And we actually thought, by 1972, that by using American air power and Vietnamese ground forces, that combination would allow us to hold off the North Vietnamese and forestall defeat. The Nixon administration did not want to lose in Vietnam. They were constantly searching for a clever strategy to make sure that we could win the war, or at least not lose the war. And of course, what happened in the end is that Congress forced Nixon's hand. Congress told the Nixon administration, you cannot use air power to rescue the situation. May 72, when we stopped the North Vietnamese offensive with tactical air power, was the last gasp. And after that, Congress made it impossible for the Nixon administration to prop up the government in Saigon with air power. And of course, what happened is that Saigon fell, the North Vietnamese won. But Nixon and, of course, Henry Kissinger, who was his national security advisor and then his Secretary of State, they did not want to lose. It's not the American way. And just to go to Afghanistan, as you well know, we were there for 20 years fighting the Taliban. We did not want to lose that war. So what this tells you is when the United States gets into a war, even when it's losing, it is very difficult to accept defeat. Very difficult. The United States is a very powerful country, and it's constantly looking for a way to win. And this is, I think, the basic logic that you see at play in the case of Iran. You and I can point out to them that this war is lost. And in a certain sense, they recognize that, but they just won't accept it. And the belief is there's just got to be a magic formula out there. After all, this is the United States of America. the greatest country in the world, the most powerful country in the world. How can you tell me? How can you tell us that that we can't defeat a small country like Iran? This can't be the case. It's that kind of logic that kicks in. And so what you see is Trump thrashing around and his advisors thrashing around looking for a solution. And there's very little evidence, at least in the public record, that anybody on the inside is saying this one's over. We lost. Let's recognize that, cut a deal, and minimize our losses, which is what they should do, because the fact is that we lost this war and there's no way we can rescue the situation. But anyway, all of this is a long-winded way of saying, Glenn, it's going to be very hard to get the United States to accept the fact that it has been defeated by the Iranians. And we will do everything we can to figure out a way to win the war.